Stanford sits on the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe,
who are the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land was, and continues to be, of great importance to Native people.
We recognize that every member of the community has benefited
and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land.
Consistent with our values of community and diversity,
we have a responsibility
to
acknowledge and make visible
the university's relationship to Native people.
Hello, welcome everyone. I'm Matthew Tews, Associate Vice President for Campus Engagement and Interim Head of the Vice Presidency for the Arts at Stanford. I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's conversation, Artists on the Future, Shirin Neshat and Abbas Milani. Let me give a brief introduction to this series, and then we'll introduce the speakers and move directly into the conversation. The idea for this series is that the arts provide us with a special window onto the truth. They present a different vantage point for observation, analysis, theorization, and consequently for understanding the world around us. Through the arts and culture, we gain insight into the changing human experience in all of its dimensions, and artists can imagine alternative futures and new modes of being and doing. We believe that artists are catalysts that drive cultural change, and art truly has the power to change the world. In times of crisis or concern, authoritarian governments have jailed artists, banned performances, and burned books. And in response, artists have put on plays in clandestine spaces, spray-painted walls as expressions of activism, constructed impromptu sculptures, or simply created art as a way of not simply representing their cause, but advocating for justice. Through our Artists on the Future conversation series, we at Stanford are positioning art and culture as central to the debate and discussion about the future. It's fitting, we feel, that this engagement with arts thinking takes place at Stanford and in Silicon Valley. More and more, Stanford's history of forward-thinking and pioneering ideas can and will translate into the arena of the arts. This evening, we're looking forward to a lively and enlightening conversation with Shirin Neshat and Abbas Milani. But first, I'd like to thank Stanford Live and the Stanford Arts staff for their work behind the scenes to make this all happen. And of course, this series would not be possible without the generosity of Komal, Shah, and Gaurav Garg. I'd like to invite Komal, an avid art collector, former tech executive, board member of SF MoMA, Stanford alumna, and longtime supporter of the arts at Stanford, to kick us off by saying a few words. Komal, over to you.
Thank you, Matthew. Welcome to Artists on the Future. I hope that this new year has brought you some relief to see dignity finally restored to our country again. And I found it so inspiring, I'm sure you might have all, to listen to Amanda Gorman. So as I introduce today's speaker, Shirin Neshat, Miss Gorman's words from her poem in 2018, "Won't You Be My Sister," come to mind. See me as the change. Say I am movement, that I am the year, and I am the era of the women. Shirin Neshat was born in Iran, but she grew up in a household infused with Western feminism, thanks to her father. Shirin came to the US in 1975 to study at UC Berkeley. And when she returned to Iran after the revolution, she was shocked to find women being forced to wear the chador, a traditional Islamic veil. And she was also surprised to see the escalating conflict between feminism and Islamic fundamentalism. After she came back to the US, Shirin created a body of work called Women of Allah, featuring photographs of women covered by Persian calligraphy. Since then, Shirin's practice has incorporated video and opera as well, and she has won many awards, including the International Award at the Venice Biennale in 1999, and the Silver Lion for the Best Director at the Venice Film Festival in 2009. About a year ago, before the shutdown hit, I met with Shirin to see her biggest survey show at the Broad in Los Angeles, I Will Greet the Sun Again. as a radiant Shirin greeted me with an immensely warm welcome. She took me through her show. We sat down on the floor watching the video Turbulent, which was an iconic video of hers. I started to witness a Pied Piper-like phenomenon around me. Our group of two eventually became a party of 50. But each of us were hanging on to every single word that Shirin spoke, and we all knew that we would never forget this moment. So we hope you will have that same indelible experience as she converses with Professor Abbas Milani, the director of Iranian Studies at Stanford, co-director of Iran Democracy Project, and a research fellow at the Hoover Institute. Professor Milani's focus and expertise on Iran will no doubt make this conversation a rich, deep, and remarkable journey to Iran and back. With that, I turn over to Matthew Tews.
Thank you, Komal. We're going to begin the conversation, and I'd like to invite Shirin and Abbas to join. And I'd like to start with a point of connection between the two of you. Komal mentioned the show at the Broad, I Will Greet the Sun Again, in 2019. And that show featured, as part of the wall text, a sentence from Abbas Milani's memoir, Tales of Two Cities. And the sentence was, "Exile is when you live in one land and dream in another." And I'd love to just talk about the connection that you saw between that sentence and the show, and the way that that informs the way that you think about your work. And Shirin, let's start with you.
First of all, I wanted to thank all of you at Stanford and Komal for inviting me for this conversation with Abbas Milani, which is a great honor for me. I know him for so many years, but we've never had this opportunity. And I felt that quote on the wall at the Broad was like a perfect starting and ending point to the exhibition. And that much of my hope is that when people look at my work and that particular exhibition, which it was one of the largest exhibitions I've ever had, that people wouldn't diminish the work only to the political ideas of the work, but the fictional part of it. And I think by that quote helped the audience to understand that much of the work is about dreaming and is about visualizing something that is not real. And it's the imagination of the artist that matters. And so I was just so happy that was on the wall as people left, and that was the last thing they saw.
Well, first of all, it is my great daunting pleasure to be talking with you. Shirin Jan, you are clearly the most acclaimed Iranian artist, Iranian-American artist, and you have done things that make all of us, not just as Iranian-Americans, as Iranians, but as people who think about the problems of the world and try to find a solution. We need to be grateful to you, and I'm personally truly honored. One of the things that I think adds to the problem of exile for someone like you, and I think anyone who comes from Iran, is that generally it is said that exiles are custodians of dead treasures. They come here, they need to reinvent themselves. But America is the land of exiles. And I think we, the generation that came after the war, after the revolution, have a double difficult task. One is, we come from a tradition that shares very little, iconically, linguistically, poetically, with the Judeo-Christian tradition that is dominant here and that is understandable here. That's why people who came from Germany, came from Europe, made Hollywood, because the language was very much the same. So we don't share that. And then we have a regime that is brutal and every day engages in some kind of egregious act. So how do you try to overcome these two obstacles, the cultural divide and the political constant trouble on the horizon created by the regime?
Well, thank you for bringing that up as the first subject we talk about, because in the introduction, I came across as this heroic figure that tries to be somewhat of a voice for Iranian women, or the complication behind the revolution, the veil, the Islamization of the country. And I just feel that everything that I've ever done, it's actually opposite to that, that I've never meant to be the voice for anyone, or to feel like I have that license to, rectify a lot of these issues that are so complex. And a lot of my ideas and work stems from personal fragility as a human being, as a woman, and what transpired in my life as a young woman, as a young adult that was separated from the family by force because of the revolution, feeling complete isolation in a country that I didn't speak the language. And then separation of good 11, 12 years where I didn't see my family, and sort of having to survive and building an identity that was without really volunteering to do so. In fact, I always wanted to go back to Iran, but I didn't have a choice because of a number of reasons. So my way of coming to terms with this duality that I've inherited as an Iranian, that emotionally, it's still very deeply rooted to Iran, and I'm still carrying a lot of unresolved emotions for my country, my separation for the family, and I think I carry that even so many years after that I'm here. But yet naturally I had to sort of embrace the culture, the American culture where I've been living in. And my education has been very much of a Eurocentric Western art history education. And somehow organically, my longing, my emotions, my unresolved relationship to Iran, and my anxieties, both existential and political, ideas sort of merged with what I was trained and learned about art history in America. And so it's been a complicated journey, of course, and I have, in some ways I have an audience and a public that is Iranian, that is living in Iran. Outside of Iran, I have the Iranian government on my back. And then I have the art critics in the West who also view the work for its artistic value. And so the degree that I sort of visit the political ideas behind the work versus the artistic, the emotional, the how much I borrow from the Middle East, the Islamic Persian tradition versus the Western tradition, it's been a really a very interesting balance to navigate. And so some of my weaker work are the ones that don't navigate very well, and some of the better, stronger work are the ones that have the more better balance in terms of, where I want to be.
I don't know how many people will have seen your last film, brief film, or the longer film, the Kulthum, In Search of Kulthum. Both of them, the last one is The Land of Dreams. It is, I think, a brilliant piece of work. And it shows this bifurcated identity. This woman who comes out of this mountain-like womb alone, and then tries to navigate the world. But at the screen, we are always confronted with two images: the woman in search of identity, and this bureaucratization of art, the commodification of art, this art critics who expect you and to put you in a different compartment. And we, as an audience, are constantly watching these two images of you navigating these two. And a single woman out in the world, finding her voice, and this bureaucracy here, that is. And then in Kulthum, searching for Kulthum, you've come very eloquently to talk about the problems that you, as a woman who wants to be your own voice, and by extension, you become the voice of many. How do you navigate all of these obstacles?
It's another excellent question. The way I have always managed developing my ideas is this parallel between the inner world, the inner anxieties, everything that is very personal, although not autobiographical, with the larger issues that relate to the world. So it's this conversation between the inner and the outer world for me. And I think that sense of duality and the fact that I am approaching all my subjects on that personal level, it helps in a lot of ways, because I always insist for people to understand this is my point of view. It's not anyone else's point of view. It's my experience about America, about Iran, etc. So this duality in terms of the personal versus the social political, and the sort of dream versus reality, the magic versus realism, it's been a way in which I can appeal to my audience in the way that the work is not reduced to some kind of particular ethnicity or a particular work that can only be understood if you relate it to a specific culture or religion, etc. Because much of the subjects that I bring about, although on the surface seem politically charged, they're really dealing with lots of emotions about humanity, about existential issues, while still really going after the issue of the question of power, tyranny, dictatorship, oppression. But it's really even, for example, the woman of Allah. It's about bringing together the different forms of paradoxical, the face of the woman that's in at once submissive but anxious and doubtful and melancholic, yet holding an arm, which obviously suggesting an idea of violence and rebellion and militancy. And so in all of my work is this tension between humanity and fragility versus the realism of sociopolitical regimes and administrations and questioning all of those. And that really goes back to myself, because I really don't have any answers for anything. I just have a lot of questions. And the way that I've learned to survive my personal circumstances is being strong, but being very conscious of my vulnerability as a human being. And I think that somehow manifests itself in my work, whether it is the form, the content, whether it's a photograph, a movie, or a video. And I think that honesty helps the film to function in a more universal level, maybe to a broader audience than just the Iranian audience or the Western audience.
Now, I think that really is, at least in my view, the key to your remarkable success. All, I think, great art is taking the personal and rendering it in a way where everyone can partake of it. Everyone can see their own faith in it. It's never beyond the personal. It's always the personal rendered in a way that is appreciated across time, across cultures. And the other problem that I think some culturally specific artists, people from Iran, let's talk about Iran, have is that they think being Iranian means only basing your art or your images in Iran, or only basing it in a kind of a film that might be shown in a Vienna festival, in a foreign festival. Your work is both personal and global, local and global. It is unmistakable, maybe with the exception of some of the images you have of America. It's unmistakably Iranian, but also remarkably global. And I think finding that mixture, the personal and the public, the specific and the global, local and global, that's why your work has such a, I think, remarkable cross-cultural appeal.
I want to point at something that I was thinking about as we were preparing for today, is that you know, when I started, and maybe we can show the image of one of the Women of Allah series, the Allegiance with Wakefulness. When I started with my first body of work, Abbas Women of Allah, it was immediately embraced but heavily attacked from the Islamic Republic of Iran for thinking that I'm anti-revolutionary, and from the people of Iran who thought I was supporting the revolution, to the Western critics who thought that I was sort of sensationalizing violence and trying to, you know, enjoy the controversy that exists around the, you know, Islam and particularly in Iran after the revolution. And I felt strongly that for the most part, people misunderstood and misinterpreted the work. So the point I'm trying to make, the move later on to other work that sort of deviates away from directly political subject, was because this form of judgments, this form of interpretations that I felt that vastly sort of ignored the very essence of what I was trying to do, what I was trying to say. And I think embracing video, but embracing other form of languages like poetry and magic realism, surrealism, dreams, incorporating ideas that sort of moved as far as they could away from realism, even became more and more stylized. And through my videos that became really stylized and just sort of abstract in a way, and enigmatic in terms of, they became this sort of strange rituals, these ceremonial events that it didn't really have any reference to any particular events or ceremony of Iranian culture anywhere, but it was referential and yet very allegorical. The idea of allegory, and where I went with it right after this series, I think it was my spontaneous reaction to the kind of judgments that was sent upon me because my work, the first body of work, was so directly political. And I feel that since then, my approach to art making has been about finding narratives, concepts, finding ways, languages that while I can still tackle deeply important sociopolitical issues, that I can appeal to the audience, that it goes far and above and beyond those ideas, that is somehow it's much more subliminal, that somehow is deeper, somehow is more layered, that cannot just be reduced to this one-liner, you know. And lastly, you know, through the realm of magic realism, surrealism, and dreams, you know, you can do anything you want. You know, you can commit the worst of crime, but you're innocent. You cannot judge somebody's dream. And so that was another way for me to beg the audience to have a conversation that it goes in different places, that is not just sort of referencing your own relationship to those political realities, whether you're Iranian or Western. We can leave this image now.
You know, I think even the most allegorical, as you call them, the most abstract of your work is, in my view, in a larger definition of what is political, profoundly political. It is non-political in a very traditional, dogmatic, socialist, realist type of criticism of art that says, if you show the proletariat singing, if you show the bourgeois fat and ugly, then your work is political. That to me is the silliest kind of politics. Politics is personal. Every time you bring your own experiences in your own agonies, you bring all of us into understanding our own agonies. Every time with the allegory, you force the audience to think with you, to become part of the meaning-making process. You're contributing to the democratization of the art. The kind of political art that claims to speak to the people is the kind of art that wants stupid people who take their message from their leader, whether the leader is a party or the artist or the critic. The most democratic form of art, in my view, is the kind of art like yours, increasingly towards the end of your work, when you have moved away from some of the very specific ones, that invite us to bring meaning. We need to bring meaning into this work. In your land of dream, it is us who has to be co-equal with you in bringing meaning. And this is the most politically, I think, liberating work art can be.
You know, it's so important to point out that people of my generation, yourself as well, we have been a product of a revolution. We have been displaced by a horrific revolution that caused all kinds of atrocities. And one of the reason I'm not able to go back and I'm in exile because, you know, I have issues with the Iranian government. So being born in a country of dictatorship, but also being a byproduct of a whole generation that were activists who went to prison or who were very politically involved. It's part of our history. It's part of my history, whether I like it or not. It was the revolution that separated me from my country, from my family. And to this day, it's politics that separates me from my country. That's there. So whether I like it or not, it's a part of my reality, my history, my identity. But then there's another part of my identity, which is Iranian culture, the vastness of Iranian literature, the enigma that lives with Iranian poetry, you know, the whole history of mysticism, literature. And so what I'm trying to say is that, you know, one of the things that I see that is ingrained in my mindset as an artist is building of that enigma within the realm of reality, within the realm of the nuts and bolts. And I understood now more than ever, I understand how I tend to go back in time and I go into the future, but I never make work about the present. Land of Dreams is the movie that at least I'm making. A lot of it is really about the future, and the work that I've done a lot is about the past. The woman of Allah, the woman without men, a lot of the work. So I think that what I'm trying to say is that, you know, with the present, I only can live it with a certain level of abstraction, enigma, and not really able to refer to it now immediately. And so I think this is something that I've borrowed heavily from being influenced by Iranian literature and the fact that it's very philosophical and it's lives somewhere in your mind and in your everyday life, but you can't apply it to speak very pragmatically about, I don't know, Abbas, I'm not able to complete my sentence in the way you could, but yeah.
But it's Iranian literature, the poetry, for example, prose, even representational art, even theater has been dominated by, for centuries, by censorship, different forms of censorship. And censorship, as Borges famously says, is the mother of metaphor. The more there are censors, and censorship can be the kind that puts a knife to your throat, or censorship can be the kind that says, unless you make an art that I like and fits my style, I'm going to take you down. That begets a kind of a metaphor, and your ability to translate that metaphor into images of stunning beauty and haunting enigma, I think is remarkable.
You're absolutely right that in many ways, as Iranian artists, whether we live in Iran or not, we give ourselves, we self-censor a great deal. For example, I give myself a lot of boundaries, and I'm a minimalist. But this must be something in my psyche, in a way that I've always, you know, had to be told that, I could be subversive, but only in an enigmatic way. Obviously the lack of freedom of expression, even during the Shah, and we've always lived under circumstances that we could never speak the truth, but either lie or through work of art, whether it's literature, film, visual art, theater, to make work that is sort of transcends censorship. And I've learned that over the time that I have always made work within a sort of form of parameters, within form of boundaries that is very non-Western. And for example, the use of metaphors, this emphasis about use of allegory, is something that is, repeatedly showing in my work. And a lot of Western critics are very perplexed by it. And I don't think they're conscious of the fact that being an Iranian, and my generation at least, even if you live outside, there's always this level of fear, that you can't really say what you want to say. And so, but I think in many ways it has worked for us to be able to really turn into our imagination and within the minimal possibilities to say a lot, and I think this reminds me of the great Kiarostami, the great evidence of film productions in Iran that have, thrived in the world, and they are so unusual and made with such little support, but their language is so, minimal and yet so powerful and meaningful.
I think that might be because the language of cinema is in some ways an existential language. Some critics say we understand the language of cinema because it is like our dreams. It's, if you think about how complicated your films are, or any film, you need to be very adept at this language to know that when you go from this shot to this shot, you've gone from New York to Paris. But we immediately make it because films are like dreams. They reconstruct that very structure. That's why I think Iranian filmmakers have been the most successful compared to Iranian writers, Iranian poets, representational art, because it taps into that kind of a archetypal understanding of dreams and has been more successful. And I think when critics will delve into some of your work, they will, I think, find that you draw inspiration as much from the poetic traditions of Iran as from Western canon. You talked about magic realism. The most facile understanding of your magic realism would be, oh yes, she learned this from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But we have a magic realist tradition in Iranian poetry, in Iranian writing, that is 800, 900 years old. And you, of the current writers, have picked Shahnoush Parsipur, who's tapped into that tradition and has written these remarkable works of fiction, which you then have turned into wonderful, wonderful images.
Yes, and I think that it's important to point out that with all of my work, it's very interesting, the reading of the Western audience versus the Iranian audience is vastly different. For example, as you were speaking, I was thinking about how many people I've met, in the US, where they say, I really love Kiarostami, but I can't say I really understand his work. His pacing is very slow, his subjects are very particular. And it just makes me realize that in Iran, as abstract or enigmatic as his work is, general people go see his work. The general audience know his work and understand it really well. So I think the relationship of Iranian people to literature and having that sort of poetic license in a way that they have utilized it years after years, living through various types of dictatorship, whether the Shah or the Islamic Revolution, is that the Iranian people comprehend really well that kind of conceptual abstract language, because they've lived with it. They've lived with the great masterpiece of novels and poetry and the mystics of ancient times. This is in their blood. Now, translating work that is rooted in that kind of foundation, like Woman Without Men, or much of the literature that I inscribe on my photograph, to an American audience or European audience, they look at it as very decorative, or the work, even the music, while it might affect them somewhat, it doesn't have the same emotional resonance as it would on an Iranian, because an Iranian feels it in their soul. But the relationship of the Western audience to that music, or to that kind of pacing, that kind of narrative, that kind of literature that is written, it's very different. And that is, Abbas John, one of the main things that I've come to terms with, that the work that I'm making has completely different resonance on different audiences because of their relationship to those material. Adding to that is the political information. And so therefore, I have to create work that at once addresses different type of people, because ultimately, actually, Komal brought up Turbulent, a video that I made that was beautiful performance of Shahram Nazari, performed, actually lip sung by Shoja Azari, but poetry of Rumi. This was the greatest discovery for me as an artist, that I really never expected that music impact the Western ear as much as it did. And the idea of that video was understood at once. Here is a woman that is rebellious and singing not traditional music, is guttural, is breaking all the rules of traditional music. Here is a man who's a conformist and sings classical music that is absolutely stunning and just wins over, and this opposition, and yet through the power of music. And so occasionally I have work that seems to sort of transcends that boundary of my audiences and cultural differences. But for majority, I feel that the interpretation, the reception of the work vastly differs according to who is looking at it. And I find that okay. Even the Persian calligraphy I write, even if you look at it purely from an aesthetic point of view, that's fine with me. The idea of beauty, it's so significant to the classic Islamic and Persian art. And I take a lot of pleasure of the fact that, people will see it in that way. And, so this is something I wanted to point out, is that, especially having that exhibition in Los Angeles, which was, one of the second largest population of Iranians outside of Iran, was really a testimony of how well understood the work suddenly became. And for majority, my work has been seen in the West.
Yes, well, I think that's the definition of a successful work of art, that different people who come to it with different levels of appreciation for the nuances can each tap into it. I'm sure someone from a Spanish background understands Buñuel differently than someone who has only is coming to it from American perspective. And that's a sign of a great work. But since one of the themes of this series is artists of the future, I have to ask you one technical question, essentially, because we live in Silicon Valley. At least I live in Silicon Valley. Stanford is in Silicon Valley. In one of the most seminal works of criticism about photography, cinema, and about art in general, Walter Benjamin talks about art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and says when mechanical reproduction becomes the dominant form, the aura, the sacred aura of art dissipates and something else happens. Now I think we are at a stage where reproduction of art is undergoing a similar paradigmatic radical change. How do you think that will impact both the production and the reception of art, your kind of art in future?
Well, I can only speak for myself, and I can tell you that while I keep persisting that my work is very emotional and it's very personal, I have always deeply care about the world, and a part of me feels like an activist that I never became, but I've never been able to distance myself from the sociopolitical reality. Yet my work is so much about aesthetics as well, and so much about emotions. And we're living in such a significant period, I mean, without a doubt. And you know, again, being Iranian, I've been trained to make work that at once works as a work of art that you can hang at a gallery or show at a festival, but speaks to a taxi driver in Iran, you know, or someone who looks at me, not even so much as an artist, but as a public figure, as someone whose voice counts to them during the Green Movement, or, at various times that I've had to speak up, as much as I didn't want to, but I had. So I feel there is this feeling of responsibility that I have sort of inherited as an Iranian artist who's been very present. And so it's very natural for me to respond to what's going on in the world constantly. But now we're talking about a very different time. That, for example, someone like myself that somehow felt connected to the Iranian community in a way of being a voice, suddenly I feel like, maybe my voice even counts in terms of what do I have to say about what is going on globally, what is going on from the pandemic to the political turmoil to the economic situation to the environment. Where does art fit in within this time of crisis? Do I bear any responsibility, or does art have any place in this conversation? And, I think that Land of Dreams was my first really attempt at going after themes and topics that were, very ambitious of me in terms of stepping out of my comfort zone of, well, I'm Iranian and I can only speak about the Middle East or Iran and the woman, and say, no, I am now speaking as an immigrant. I'm talking as an American as well as Iranian. And I want to offer my point of view about my impression about this country that I have worshipped, that has given me home, and that I consider that my voice is as significant as a Native American. And this is the way I see it. And the sense of political injustice, the idea of racism, the rise of white supremacy, the anxiety of people about violence, the nuclear holocaust, and all of that. And so, but then approaching it on that personal dimension and taking myself to New Mexico and creating this narrative in the video, photographing over 200 people, of Native Americans to African American to the Latino to different, immigrant population it's like my way of engaging in something that I think it's so significant, the voice of immigrants in America. So, I mean, just the long ways of answering you, I feel that the artists are responding and in their own ways, according to who they are, what is the nature of their work. And I think I'm responding as an Iranian-American immigrant.
Mm-hmm. You can't talk about cinema and art and not at least use one French word. So I have to use the French word, the auteur theory in cinema. If you look at your work as an author, the turbulent is very much continued in your recent work. I see them exactly as parallel structures. A woman primarily screaming in the turbulent to an empty audience. This time, a defiant woman going out to try to make sense and facing in the other one, Shahram Naziri, in spite of all his beautiful voice, but it's in a very constricted, limited, isolated, alienated auditorium. Here too, your double is constantly being literally persecuted. There's an inquisition about her work. So as an auteur theory, this woman who's standing alone in the world and says heroically, I want to make sense out of this world, and I will make sense of it, and I will bend it to my desire for justice.
Thank you for saying that, and I feel that what I'm happy about with Land of Dreams, it was a big step for me to take to adventure into filming in the United States and having Western subjects, and actually for the first time, photographing, American people and writing Farsi calligraphy. But I think there's a humanity in these faces of people and the characters that she interviews and collects their dreams, and the reality that our dreams, which are a projection of our anxieties, are not that different from one another, whether we come from Iran or from the US. And particularly in these moments of pandemic, I think people really related to this work in a way that is this sort of unifying theme that, we're all humans and we are subjected to live within some form of tyranny, one form or another, different degrees. And some ways we're all sort of a victim of that, but at the same time, there's incredible amount of strength and dignity and pride that shows in those faces of the people and the Americans that I've worked with. So I was really very delighted, and this work is still new and being digested, but I was really glad to have taken that step and to see that the film, the work seems sort of relevant.
So I hate to break in here. This has been an incredible conversation, and I know we could all listen to both of you talk for the rest of the evening, but I'm conscious of our time, and we do have some questions from the audience that were submitted in advance, so I want to make sure we get a chance to touch on a couple of those. So maybe let me start with one that is actually touching on something, Shirin, that you mentioned in your recent response. And this is a question from a Stanford student asking, has your artwork changed in any way since COVID? Is there any way in which the pandemic has changed the work that you're doing?
I would say that it has changed me as a human being, like it has many people. I think none of us will be the same after this period. There's been a great moment of reflection. And I was talking the other day to some friend that, I used to feel very nervous about exposing new work or making work and the people's judgment as if it was about people grading me, and something has changed in me as I feel so much that is so much more important to communicate and create a dialogue in this very difficult time, and how important culture is, and less about what people think, how great it is or it's not. Maybe I'm being foolish, but I think we live in such an incredibly volatile time that is not really about success or acceptance or being valued in any ways, but being able to make an impact and to create a conversation. And we all learn to be humble. And I think that's my biggest lesson, that, hey, I may not just made the best work this year, or I've certainly been very productive, but I've learned the humility is really important, and to have a dialogue with my audience, less about stars or grading, and I think this was maybe more of an issue for me, whether people accept me or dismiss me, and less so now.
It's interesting how the role of art and culture in our society has changed so much, and the way that people engage with it and what it can do and be for people is dramatically changing. a question really about history, and maybe I'll turn to this to both of you, and Abbas, we can start with you. How do you think about gender equality in present day Iran? And maybe if you could compare it to the historical past with Persian women who were very powerful.
Absolutely. I want to say just one word about what this last year has meant. I think for me, it has been a very humbling experience. It has shown both the fragility of our globe and the fragility of American democracy. It has been absolutely, for me, a humbling experience. And if we don't come away from this recognizing how fragile we are as a species that is plundering this world, how a virus can bring us to a grinding halt and nothing we can do, and how American democracy has come very close to being broken. If we don't take this to heart, and if we don't correct our ways, we are in for darker winters. In terms of Iranian women's movement, I think one of the, still in spite of the remarkable work that Shirin has done, in spite of the remarkable work that other scholars have done in writing about women's movement, about women's literature, about the politics of women's feminist struggles in Iran, that story still hasn't been told as it should be. I think Iranian women have been for the last 100 years a key component of the fight for democracy, for equality, and in the last 40 years, they have been at the forefront of it. I think the Iranian women have fought a civil disobedient battle against this regime and its forced hijab that is equal to anything that we have seen in the American civil rights movement. Nasrin Sotoudeh, who took part of her inspiration from Gandhi, part of it from Mandela, is in prison right now because she has defended the right of a woman to say, I want to dress myself the way I want. So it is a remarkable period in ascendancy of women in the political movement. And it does go back to a long history. The first woman who Shirin reminds me of most, her name is Ghoratullain. 150 years ago, folks, before the first feminist gathering in America, an Iranian woman goes on stage, takes off her veil, and begins to recite her talk. And she's a poet. And the sight is so unusual. Two of her own compatriots, one takes a knife to his own throat, and the other one tries to attack her. That's how defiant she was 150 years ago. In that tradition now stands Shirin Neshat. And in between, thousands who have gone to prison, who have been, whose faces have been deformed by acid, by dogmatists, women who've been denied access to university, they have continued the fight. And Iran is the better place for it. And the world is a better place because women are getting their more or less equal right. In America, we have the first vice president, we have the first secretary of the Treasury. The ceilings, folks, are happily being broken.
I just echo everything that Abbas said. I've certainly taken a lot of inspiration by Iranian women authors like Forough Farrokhzad, Shamrish Parsipour, a number of different ladies, but just in general, the new generation of Iranian women, all of whom are against the wall. And it seems like the more you put the women of Iran against the wall, the more rebellious they become and more empowered. And to this day, I really take inspiration in them, and including my own mother and sisters. And so, yeah, it's a great testimony of the strength of Iranian women today and in the past.
Well, maybe following on that and thinking about the exploding ceilings, the final question for us today, and this is really about the evolution of the political reality of a country, of countries, and how art that is engaged with those political issues evolves as the politics evolve. And I think particularly thinking about the US today and where we are and US-Iranian relations, perhaps, there is some evolution here. And I'm curious to hear both kind of in general how you think about that, but in particular, Shirin, how you're thinking about that for your work. So Abbas, let's start with you.
In terms of US-Iran relations, it has been a very complicated relationship. It has been ongoing for 200 years. Iran has been very much, the Iranian population, Iranian politicians have been very much impressed with America. America was, till a few years ago, literally the only Western country that Iranian nationalists looked up to as someone to counterbalance British and Russian colonialism. We are now in a choppy period, but I think the future looks bright because the biggest ally of the United States in Iran are the Iranian people. There is overwhelming evidence that of all the Muslim countries, with the exception of Israel, where the people are most essentially impressed by the United States, want to come to the United States, want to get educated in the United States, look up to US films, US music, US fashion, is Iran. So I see a very bright future in spite of these choppy current troubles.
I really, sometimes I'm very optimistic, and I hope I see the day that I can go back to Iran and see my family and be home again. It's been years and years and years since I've been to Iran. And some days I just feel like it will never happen in my lifetime. So it's the question of relationship between US and Iran, but it's also the question of Iranian government and how it would treat its citizen inside and outside of the country. And so we have endless problems and issues. And I think we are suffering, a lot of us on the outside, and there are people who are suffering inside. And it's very deeply sad. And I think we have accepted this reality to the point sometimes I think it's unfortunate. I speak with my mother every day, every single morning, and we never see each other, and I keep thinking about how it seems so normal not to have seen each other for years after years after years, and how we have lived with it, and sort of, we didn't even want to admit to ourselves how painful that has been, how decades have gone by and we haven't really been in the same place for more than a few days. And so the calamities, the pain that the Iranian people have experienced is so profound, and that I don't even know how you can, fix that. I think that at least with our generation, we will go with this pain probably forever. And I do want to see, I'm an optimist, and I do like to see light at the end of the tunnel, but I have a hard time with that. And but certainly I hope for the people in Iran, and there's a more relaxed situation, so they could have a better economic situation, they could travel, because at the moment they have issues with the inside and the outside of the country, and that's even worse than us. So because I feel very privileged in many ways for the freedom that I have. So there's just many things to say about this question that you had, but I pray for the brighter days ahead for all of us. And I just want to say the last thing, that since this is the last question, I can't tell you how nervous I was today, Abbas, to be speaking to one of the most important intellectuals of Iranian background today, and who is this more fictionalized artist and intuitive person, to say how honored I am and grateful for Stanford to bring us together, who, although we know each other and each other's family for so long, we've never done this. And so I feel so ignorant comparing to you, but thank you for accepting to speak to me, and I hope it was of interest to other people.
As we say in Persian, machakeri.
We are so honored and grateful to both of you for agreeing to speak with us this evening, for agreeing to speak with each other. Thank you so much. This has been really incredible, incredibly enlightening and moving. And we're really grateful for your time and your insights. And we look forward to a time when we can all get together in person and hear from each other and see your work in person. So thank you both very much.
Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.